Good morning, class. So, we all know where we are in the part of the SAIL Virtual Tech Talent Program. We are still in the JavaScript phase, which is the last phase of this program. So, for today's class, we'll be talking about conditional statements. And without wasting time, let's quickly see what we have in the content. So, here in the content section, today's class is actually divided into two sections. So for the first section, we have that to be conditional statements. Under this section, we'll get to know what conditional statements are. We would also see the types of conditional statements in JavaScript. So as you can see on the screen, under that part of this section, we have three different types of conditional statements, which begins with the if statement, the if else statement, and the if else if statement. Now, under each of these conditional statements, we'll get to see what their flowchart looks like. Now, the flowchart is just a diagrammatic representation of the flow of a program. So we'll be seeing the flowchart regarding to each of these conditional statements. We would also see the syntax and the examples of each. Now, for the second section, we have the switch statement. So this switch statement is quite similar to the conditional statement, but it's a little advanced. So under this section, we'll get to know what a switch statement is. We'll also get to know how the switch statement actually works, because it works differently with differently with the conditional statement. It works in a separate way. We'll also see a basic syntax of the switch statement and a very brief example. Now, as we all know, after every section, we would always have a practical demo on what we learned. So we would obviously have one today on conditional statements and on the switch statement. So let's move on to the first section of today's class, which is conditional statement. Now, a very quick question. What are conditional statements? In JavaScript, conditional statements are statements used to determine the flow of execution of a particular program depending on different conditions. Now, if you notice very well from what we've been learning about up until this moment, every code we've put out there on JavaScript has always been rendered on the browser, in as much as the syntax was correct and it wasn't commented. It has always been rendered on the browser. And one thing you might not know is that by default, that's how the program actually works. But here with conditional statements, we can actually determine what to run on the browser and what not to run. And what I mean is this: you could have a case whereby you want a particular code to run if a particular output looks like this, and then you would want it not to run if the output looks, if the value looked like a different thing that was there before. So with conditional statements, that's actually the concept that makes this very possible. So we'll be seeing how the whole thing plays out when we get to the practical demo of today's class. So under the conditional statement, if a condition is seen to be true, that means if it evaluates to be true, or if the condition is satisfied, the execution of code would occur where that condition is met. So this has to deal with you defining some several conditions. Now, if this condition is true, a particular block of code would execute. But if it turns out false, that means if it's not true or if it is not satisfied, then two things could happen. One of the things that could happen is the fact that execution would not occur at all. By that, we mean that the moment the condition is not met and there was no block of code defined for that kind of situation, of course, nothing would execute, nothing would work. It would just go from there to the very end of the program and you'll get an empty result. But there is also another situation where a different kind of execution would occur. So this means that if the condition was to be false, it's either nothing would happen at all or a different kind of execution of code would occur. And now this execution of code is going to be very different from the one that would occur if it was true. So you can either have it to be this way or to be in the other way. But just know that once the condition is not met, it always takes either of these two actions. So next we have types of conditional statements. Now in JavaScript, there are majorly three types of conditional statements. In fact, in full sense, this is probably all the conditional statements we have in JavaScript, just these three. And so we have this to begin with the if statement. After the if statement, we also have the if else statement. And lastly, we have the if else if statement. So you can say that the last one here could be a combination of the if statement and the else statement together. But anyway, we'll get to see how each of them actually look like. So for the if statement specifies a block of code to be executed only if a condition is true. So this means that on your JavaScript, you can actually define a condition and you can do it in such a way that if this condition is satisfied, then a particular block of code should be executed or should run. Now, if in another situation that condition was not satisfied or was not true, then nothing would work. It would only work only if the condition is true. And so here we have a flowchart of the if statement. So like I said before, the flowchart is actually a diagrammatic representation of the flow of the entire program. So it's just a diagram to explain how the flow of a program actually works. So looking at this diagram we have on the screen, it begins at this point here. It's like a very, very small blue circle. So that's like the starting point of your program or of your code. Now you have the arrow that comes after that. And after this arrow, you have a diamond shaped 2D structure. Now within that structure, you have the condition there. So what this means is that you've actually gotten to the point where you've set that condition. Now that we've gotten there, there are two things that could happen. It's either the condition could be met, which is true, or the condition might not be met, which is false. Now, if this condition that we have here is satisfied, which is true, it would take the flow of control from this condition here to the if code. So what the if code basically here means is our JavaScript code. So that's like the code that we already set out to execute if the condition is true or is met. And then after this if code, you get to the end of your program. That's right here. But now in another situation where the condition is not met or is false, the flow of program would not take this route at all. Rather, it would skip this if code and it would just branch at the end of the program, which is why if we should look at this diagram very well, where you have the false statement, the false Boolean expression, you can see that nothing actually happens. It just branches this if code, it skips it, and it goes to the end of the program. So in this situation, once the condition is not met or is false, nothing actually runs. It just skips the other one and goes to the end of the program. So a very, very brief syntax of the if statement is this that we have on the screen. So it begins with the if keyword. Obviously, we know what a keyword is now. A keyword is a reserved word in JavaScript that serves a specific function. So by now we should know that this if here cannot be used as an identifier or variable name or thereabout. Now this syntax for the if statement begins with the if, and in the bracket here we have the condition. So this is exactly where we would state the condition we want to put out. So now after we have this condition, we have our curly braces. We all know what the curly braces is. And so inside these curly braces, we would actually put out the code that we want to execute if this condition is true. So this is a very, very brief syntax of the if statement. For some of the other, for some kind of syntax, it could look more than this. You could actually define some other statement before the if statement. But very, very briefly, this is exactly how you would have it on VS Code. So next we have a brief example of the if statement. And so on this page, we actually begin with a variable name, that is the $ age. So you can see on the first line here, we have the let keyword, which we all know is used for variable declaration. So we have our variable name, $age, and this variable name now holds an integer value of 34. So that means the age, $age here, is of this value. Now we move on to applying our if syntax. So we have our if keyword, and then inside the bracket we have a condition we've set out. Now we've said $age less than 18. So what this basically means is that it's going to take the value that the $age holds, and it's going to compare it with this other value here. So this means that $age less than 18, behind the scenes it actually means 34 less than 18. And is 34 less than 18? Obviously no. 34 is greater than 18. So because this particular example we have is not met, this code we have here, that's within these curly braces, is not going to run, it's not going to execute. So don't be surprised if you don't see anything on the screen. It is expected to be that way because the condition was not met. Now talking about the code within the curly braces, we have our document.getElement by ID with an ID name of P1, and this is assigned the value of the string value of you are not an adult. So what this means is that the only way this particular code can execute is only if the $age is lesser than 18. So let's assume instead of having 34 here that we already have now, let's assume we have something like 11. Of course, this statement will compare the new value of 11 to 18 and would actually check if it's lesser than 18. And as we all know, 11 obviously is lesser than 18. And so because the condition now is true, this particular statement here would execute. So you would have you are not an adult on the screen. That's when it's rendered on the browser. So a quick recap on what I just explained. about the if statement. If the condition for x is true, the JavaScript code in between the curly braces will be executed. But if it's false, nothing would occur. So that's just a brief example of the if statement, and we'll actually have much more examples when we get to VS Code. So next we have the if else statement. Now the if else statement specifies a block of code to be executed if a condition is true, and it also specifies another block of code to be executed even when a condition is false. So this basically means that whether a condition is met or not, something is going to be executed. So in this situation, you would actually define a condition. Now, if that condition is met, a particular block of code would run. If the condition is not met, another different block of code would also run too. So here you're not going to have a blank result. You are going to have a particular result which will be determined on if the condition was true or false. So here we have the flowchart of the if else statement. And as you can see, we have our starting point right here. And from this starting point, the flow of the program gets to where the condition is. Now, as I explained before in the last flowchart, if the condition here is true, the if code would execute. That's the code in between the curly braces close to the if. It would run. But now, if this condition is not met and it's false, the else code would actually execute. So this means that you're actually going to define another separate code to execute even when the condition was not satisfied or was false. And after the execution of the else code, it would obviously branch the if code and move on to the end of the program. So here you have either of this code, one of them would definitely be executed. Now, mind you, something to note here is the fact that you can never have the two codes executed. It is not possible. You can only have one code executed at a time. So this means that if the if code is going to execute, the else code will not execute. And if the else code is going to execute, then the if code will not execute. Only one out of the two can execute for every program. So let's move on and see the syntax. So here we have the syntax of our if statement. That's our if else statement. And it also begins with the if keyword, which is followed by the condition. So you are going to actually define the condition within the brackets here. That's the normal bracket. And then if this condition is met, this particular portion of code that would be here would be executed. But if it's not met, we now have the else keyword here, which is used to represent the else, the else part of this entire statement. Now, this particular else statement here would only execute if the if section turns out to be false. So if you have this to be false, this one automatically would be true. And if you have this to be true, this else here would be false. So that was why I said that you can never have the two sections of code being executed. Only one can execute out of the two of them. So if the if should execute, the else will not. And if the if should not execute or should be false, then the else statement would execute. Yeah, so here we have a brief example of the if else statement, and we obviously begin by declaring a variable name of $age with the value of 31. Now, we have our if statement and we have a condition that has been declared. Now, the condition here is to check if the value for the variable name of $age is lesser than 18. Looking at it very well, our variable name holds a value of 31, and 31 is not lesser than 18. So this means that automatically the this particular block of code we have here would not execute. By that I mean the document.getElement by ID, which is assigned the value of you are not an adult, would not execute at all. It would not run. It would not be rendered on the browser. And so if this doesn't render on the browser, then automatically this else section we have here is actually what is going to execute. So what we would have on the screen would be congratulations, you are an adult. And this is actually because the age here is actually bigger than 18 and the condition was not met and was not true. So the else here, where we have the document or get element by ID, which is assigned the value of congratulations, you are an adult, would be what would execute on the screen. So irrespective of the number you have here, in as much as it satisfies the condition, it will execute. Even when it doesn't satisfy the condition, it would still execute, but a different type of code. So lastly, we have the if else if statement. Now, the if else if statement is an advanced form of the if else statement. So it's basically very similar to the if else. It's just, a little bit of advancement in terms of how the entire syntax appears and what it can do. So the if else if statement accesses multiple conditions and executes code based on the most suitable condition, which could be true or false. So for the if else if statement, you're not going to have a single condition like the way you have it in the if statement and in the if else statement. Here you're going to have multiple conditions. And so depending on how true or how false the conditions are, it will actually depend on what particular code would execute. So I'm going to show you guys now the flow chart and I would explain how this actually works. Okay, so here we have the flow chart and it looks, quite complex compared to the if and the if else. So like I said before, for the if else if statement, multiple conditions are being accessed. So to begin this program, we have our starting point right here. And the very first condition that we have here is the first condition to be accessed. Now, if this condition here is true, which we have here, the if code for this condition would be executed and all these other, you know, conditions here would not even be rendered at all, because the moment this condition here is true, all this that we have here will be ignored completely. It would be like they wouldn't be needed, it wouldn't be necessary, in as much as the very first condition was already certified to be true. But in another situation where this condition was not met or turned out to be false, another condition now would be tested. And here we have condition number 2. So it's going to leave condition number 1, which is this condition here. If it's not true, it would access condition number 2 and check if this one turns out to be true. Now, if condition number 2 turns out to be true, the else if code for this condition would actually be executed. And once this is executed, the if code here and even the else if code and the else code, every other thing would be ignored completely. So this basically means that in conditional statements, you can only have just one particular block of code executing. You can never have more than one. It can only be one. So here for the condition number 2, if it's true, the else if code would work and it would, from this part, branch to the end of the program. But if in another situation, condition number 2 was not also met, it would divert or change the flow of program to condition number 3. Now we are in the third condition and it's going to check if it's true here or false. Now, if for condition number 3 it turns out true, the else if code for this particular condition would execute. And the moment this code executes, it would branch to the end of the program, ignoring the ones that even appeared before it and the ones after. It would just ignore any other thing else. But now, even when this condition number 3 here is not met, we still have one final option, which is the else code here. So in a situation where the condition 3 here is false, the else code will be like the default option, or what we might call the last option. That's like the last chance, the last choice we have would be this else code. So in a case where the first condition, the second condition, and the third condition turns out to be false, this is the only thing that would execute the else code. And so the moment this executes, it would also ignore any other code and it will branch to the end of the program. So this is actually how the if else if statement actually works in terms of its flowchart. So for this particular example, we only have 3 conditional statements. So this means that in actual sense, you can have as much conditional statement as you want. You can have as many as possible. You can have 5, 6, 7, as much as you desire, as much as you feel is needed. But just know that if every single condition is not met, it would eventually result to the else code here being executed, and then your program would end. So that's how the if else if flowchart actually works. So here we have a syntax of the if else if, and so for this syntax we actually made use of just one else if code. So this also begins with the if keyword here. We already know how this works. You have your condition here. If this condition is met, the code within the if block would execute. But if the condition turns out to be false, it would move on to the next else if condition. Now it's going to check if the if that we have in this else block here is actually true. And mind you, it will only execute this particular if that we have here only if the first if was false and this one here was true. Now, like I said before, you can have multiple else if statements as much as you want. But if if all the conditions turn out to be false, then you would have your last option, which is the else statement. So here in the else section of this syntax, the codes here would only be executed if the first and the second condition here were false. So that's the only way this would actually execute. So finally, we have a very brief example of the if else if statement. And on the first line of this example, we've declared the variable name $age with the integer value of 20. Now, after this, we have our if statement with a certain condition, which is to check if the value for our variable name is lesser than 18. Of course, 20 is not lesser than 18, so the if block would not execute. So this means you are not going to have the document.write you are not an adult executed, since 20 is not less than 18. Now, after it checks this condition and it sees that it isn't true, it would move on to the next condition, which is in the else if block. And so in the else if block, it would compare the value of 20. Is 20 lesser than 24? Of course, 20 is lesser than 24. So because this condition was met or was true, this particular code we have here would execute. And the code here is document.get element by id of the id name of p1 dot inner html, which is assigned the value of still a young adult. So if we should render this on the browser, we are only going to have this particular result displayed on the screen and not the one we have above or even the one we have in the else statement. But if in another situation this condition was not met, then our last option would be for the else block here to be executed. And here we have document.get element by id with an id name of p1, assign the value of wow, you are a full grown adult. Now, before we leave this example, there's one thing I want you guys to know, and that is the fact that this particular variable name of age, which is assigned the value of 20, it actually met this else if condition here, and it also met this else condition here. Because, like I said before, the else condition here is only meant to execute if this first one is false. So 20 lesser than 24 is true, and also this would have been true if the else if did not exist. So in retrospect, this particular um age, which is assigned the value of 20, actually met this else if and this else statement in a way, since the else statement actually defines that in as much as this if was not met, this would execute. That's when we talked about the if else statement. But looking at these two here, one of them is actually much more suitable than the other, and that's actually the else if statement. And this is because the else if statement has actually narrowed it down to check if the value for the age is lesser than 24. So if the value for the age is lesser than 24, this would run instead of this. Now, the reason why I said so is because we could also have another else if code here, and the another else if code could be defined by saying $age is less than 30. Now here we have $age is less than 24. 20 is less than 24. In the next else if, 20 is also less than 30. But then the two portions of code cannot execute. So it would look for the one that is most suitable between the two of them. And of course, 24 is smaller than 30 in terms of how close it is to this particular value here. So it would rather execute this one than another else if statement that has been defined to check if it's less than 30. And so For those who might not get this, I would explain how this actually works out when we get to VS Code. So for the second section of today's class, we have the switch statement. So what is a switch statement? A switch statement is a statement that performs execution of a particular code based on different cases. So this particular statement here performs execution on code depending on the different cases that appear within a program. Now, out of the different cases we would have, only just one case would execute and not all the cases. And so a switch statement is also very similar to the if else if statement. In fact, one might say that they basically do the same thing. The only difference here is the fact that a switch statement is much more convenient to use and it's also more efficient because here you can actually determine the exact condition you want to check. Like, you can actually be more precise with it using the switch statement. So here we have how the switch statement actually works, because the way it works is a little different from the if else, although it looks the same, but then it just does it in quite a different way. So under this section, the switch statement begins with an evaluation which happens just once. Now, after this evaluation, it goes down to comparing the value of the evaluation or the expression with each value in each of the cases in the switch. So this means that after the switch statement has evaluated, it's going to compare the value with each of the values we have in each cases. Now, if there is a match in the switch statement, by that we mean that if the value of the expression and the value of a particular case are seen to be the same, which makes it true, then the particular code block which is connected to that case would be executed. And lastly, if there is no match at all, then a default block would also be executed. So here, irrespective of the fact that the value might be there or not, something would always be executed, which is why it is very, very similar to the if else if statement. So here we have a very brief syntax of the switch statement, and it begins with the switch keyword. So this switch here is actually a keyword, and we cannot use this as a variable name, identifier name, function name, and thereabout. So it is followed by the normal bracket, which would hold a particular expression. Now the value of this expression would be checked through all these cases we have here, which are inside these curly braces. So we have case X here, and this case X actually represents one of the cases. And so under this case X here, we have some codes to be executed. So after this particular case X, below it is where you would have your codes. And after this, you must always end your cases with break keyword. Now there are two new keywords we are not really familiar with here. We have the case keyword here. So this case keyword is actually used to define a particular case under the switch statement. And also we have the break keyword here. Now what this break keyword does is that it breaks the flow of program from that particular part of the switch statement that was executed. So this means that in a situation where you don't have this break keyword here and this particular case was actually turned out to be true, it is going to execute this code here, but it would also execute the ones that come after it if they don't also have break keyword. So that's why the break keyword is very important. So we also have another case here which represents another case that can be checked. And lastly, we have the default here. So this default would only execute if the case X and case Y turned out to be false. Now, if you notice very well, after the case X, we have the break that ends it. After the case Y, we have the break that ends it. So I said that these break keywords are important to actually stop the flow of program. If you don't add this break keyword, your program would run fine, but it would also execute other blocks of code that weren't meant to run at all. So that's why the break is always important in the switch syntax. Next, we have an example of the switch statement, and we begin by declaring a variable name, which is day, and we assign that a value of Tuesday, which is a string value anyway. So after this, we have our switch statement or our switch keyword, and inside this curly not curly, normal bracket, we have our variable name here, which is day. Now the day here represents the expression, and this the value for this expression is going to be compared with every case within the switch statement. So you can see that the first case we have here is case with a value of Monday, and if this is true, this particular code would execute document.write a good Monday. And we also have the break keyword that ends this case here. Now after that case, we have the next case, which is the case of Tuesday. And if you notice very well, this particular case here is actually true, since the day variable name is assigned the string of Tuesday. So because this and this are the same, this particular code here would run. And here we have document.write a good Tuesday. Now, just a reminder, the document.write is only for testing purposes. The reason why I have it here is just because the document.get element by ID is there's a lot of syntax on the screen, and it wouldn't contain all of this on one screen. So back to the switch statement. After the case of Tuesday, we have the break keyword, which is used to break the flow of execution. And lastly, we have the default, and the default here has its own code, which is document.write a good day. Now the default would only execute if the value for this case was not the same here and was not also the same for this case. So imagine we had the day variable name to hold a value of Saturday or Sunday or Friday. Because the value would not be the same with this and this default here would turn out to be the only thing that would execute. So we'll get to see how all this actually plays out on VS Code. Okay, so here we are in the last section of today's class, which is a quick demo on conditional statements and switch statements. So I'll be showing you guys how the conditional statements actually work, and I would also show you guys how the switch statements also works too. So let's move on to VS Code. We define our HTML. We already have a JavaScript. We'll probably need another one. Main 2.js. You know what's next? The boilerplate, and of course connecting our JS with HTML. Now we have this. So for the first demo, we would have the if
Hello,
statement.
good morning, sir.
Yeah, good morning.
Hello, sir.
Yup, I can hear you.
Yeah, I have something to chip in. Yes, I have something to chip in.
Okay.
When you are declaring your variable, I think you don't need to put that dollar sign because it is not a PHP.
Okay. Um.
That's my observation, sir.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, but it was giving error. Really.
Okay. So what I believe
All right,
here.
sir.
Yeah. Thank you. So the reason why I did that was because I was trying to follow the rule of identifiers, which means that you can actually begin a variable name with the dollar sign, the underscore, or the yeah, with the dollar sign and underscore, or with the alphabet, which could be uppercase and lowercase. That's why you have it that way. So you made mention of an error. Did that actually happen? Let me try it with this again. We would have dollar sign name, which would hold a string. Let me call this Edward. So next we have our if statement. And for this if statement, we'll make use of the comparison operators. I know we've not touched operators anyway, but hopefully before the end of the program, we would look into the different operators in JavaScript. So for this, we would have the name here to be compared with this particular string. Let me just give it something else. And here we would have what we want to execute. Okay, so I think we'll have heading tags id of 3. So what we would want to output should actually be good morning. So right now with the way it is, we shouldn't expect anything to work because our variable name here is given the value of Edward, and we have Adewumi, which is being used to compare to that value. So running this on the browser, obviously we have a blank result. So the next thing I'll do is to change this to the Edward. And now we should have good morning class on the screen. Yeah, good morning class. We could also concatenate this with the variable we have. We already know how to do this. This would have good morning. Good morning, Edward. Yeah. Good morning, Edward. So this is just a basic way you could actually make use of the if statement. It's very, very simple, very, very plain. And I think, yeah, it's the most basic of all. So the next we'll have is the if else statement. Okay, so I do not know. Someone said the dollar sign gave him an error in JavaScript. I'm really surprised, but I'm aware that in PHP that actually means something else. So the syntax are just different anyway. So let's use the age we had before. Give this value 29. Now we have our if and also our else block. This is for the if else statement. The next thing we do is we check the dollar sign age. I would see if this is less than 18. If it's less than 18, we would have document.get member ID. Call this P2. This would be you are not an adult. Or else, if it's greater than or equals to 18, we would have this to print out. You can just copy this anyway. You are full or just something basic. You're an adult. This one. So now the age which has the dollar sign age which has the value of 29, or probably we could just
Sorry,
take
my
this
bad.
off.
Sorry, the dollar sign didn't give an error. My syntax was wrong. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. So thank God that actually works out for you. But anyway, for simplicity, let me just take away the dollar sign. So we'd have this to be age. Now we have the age variable name assigned the value of 29, which obviously is greater than 18. So this wouldn't run. I would expect this right here to execute. Yeah, so we have here you are an adult. Nice one. Hmm. Now if I should change this to 11, something lower, we should have this give us something different. You are not an adult, obviously. And if we should also have 18 itself, this would give us one of the two results, and it gives us you are an adult. Nice one. And this is because the condition here strictly said that the value of age must be lesser than 18 for this to execute. So the only way we can execute this one, even with the value being 18, is giving this the less than or equals to sign. So now we should have you are not an adult. Yeah, you are not an adult. So the conditional statements here, they make use of the comparison operators a lot, and I know we've not touched operators anyway, but hopefully we'll be seeing that next week. So we'll know the different operators in JavaScript and how they all work. So one last thing I want to do here is to add a kind of JavaScript function which is used for inputting from a user. The prompt here would be enter your age, and so this would actually give us a kind of dialog box on the screen, and inside that box you would obviously put in your age there, and so it's going to compare your age to what we have set right here, that's now. So I'm going to get rid of this equals to sign. We'll leave this to be lesser than 18. And now if I save this and go back to the browser, we have a dialog box. I know it's quite small, but it says enter your age. So if I should enter 67, it says you are an adult. Nice one. If I should reload this page and enter 17 and click on OK, we have you are not an adult. So that's a way of accessing user input using JavaScript. So lastly, we'd look into the if else if statement. If else if. So I don't think we need this anymore. Well, I'll take this out. I'll leave this with a fixed value of 26. So this begins with the if keyword, and here would have the else if. So another if would come here again. You can see now we have the else if condition. Yeah, we're going to have multiple else ifs. Have another if else. Yeah, so we have this now. So now we have three conditions here, one if and two else if, and then it ends with our else statement. Okay, I have anything to say before I move on? Okay, so I think it's time to move on. So I'll declare a variable here. I will declare school grades. Let's call this math grade. And so this math grade is actually going to be something that we'll get from the user. This will be enter your mathematics score. So whatever this user enters, it will actually be compared to the different conditions, and whichever one is met, you will actually have an output for it. So for the first condition, we'll compare the math grade and see if it's lesser than or equals to 70. I'm guessing this is actually an A grade anyway. Here we have our document dot get element by ID. Okay, before then, let me define where we'd have this. Create a horizontal row here. for these remarks. Our ID of P3 in HTML. And so if the maths grade is equals to 70 or above, okay, it's actually supposed to be greater than or equals to 70 or above. We'll have a remark like excellent, excellent, excellent work, keep it up. Here, if the maths grade is greater than or equals to 60, for this we could have another, you know, let's just give this some space. Looks proper. Quite standing. Remarkable. Just a little more. And you're good. The next one would have this to be greater than or equals to 50. A fair result. You can do better. Potential to do better. So that's a different output if the maths grade is greater than or equals to 50. And if we should have anything less than 50, since we have 50 now to be the lowest point, we'll just have this to be, you know, hmm, not bad. Oh, sorry, try again next time. So now we have all this, and so it's time to run this and see what we have. Now, okay, this still shows age. Might need to reload this again. Okay, so it says enter your mathematics score. As far back as I remember, 68. Quite remarkable, just a little more, and you're good. If I should reload this and I should enter 34, which is not a good score. sorry, try again next time. I should reload this. Someone who's very, very brilliant. Excellent work. Keep it up. We can also output the score on the screen. It's quite easy to do too. So we have this to be okay. This here would have document or get would create another ID name for this. I'll probably call this P4. And so for P4 would have mathematics score. Copy this to every section. Okay, so we have this now. And so, okay, I'm going to change this to heading 4 or 5. Heading 4, we would have to reload this. So it says enter your math score. We have 67. Yeah, so we have mathematics score 67. Quite remarkable, just a little more, and you are good. We could also have this for multiple subjects, but time will not permit us to try out different subjects, so we are just going to follow just one. So it'll be 98. 98. Excellent work. Keep it up. So this is just a basic way you could use the if statement, the if else, and also the if else if. So the last one we'll be trying out is the switch case. That's the switch statement. For this, I'll begin with another variable name. Probably call this favorite favorite drink. And this is also something that would accept input from users. Enter favorite. So next we'll have our switch statement. Here we would have the variable name favorite drink. Have our brackets. That's our curly braces. So we'd have the first case, the case of with the value of let's say Coca-Cola. And so if a user's favorite drink is Coca-Cola, this is what we should get outside. would have a separate one for this drink. Inner HTML. And so we would have this to be the favorite drink itself plus cola is, I don't know. Honestly, I don't like this. Then it's a good drink anyway. Our next case would have another value. Just define all of them. I'll have like five of them here. Malt. Heineken. Just call the last one fruit juice. And would have a default. So after this, would have a break keyword here, which would actually break the flow of the program if this um case was true. So for the Fanta would have,
Continuation.
okay,
I can see that in this you use a colon for the separation at the end of each case.
okay, column as how?
As in at the end of Fanta now you see that it's column that you used to end it instead of semicolon that we used to use before.
Okay, okay, thank you. So the reason is this: the semicolon is actually used to separate statements from each other. It's something you could use to, divide a statement from another statement. It signifies the end of a statement. But here in the switch statement, the colon we have here is not ending anything. In fact, it's actually defining the code that we want to execute in that particular case. That's why we have this to be the normal colon, not semicolon. So I hope you got that. What can I put for Fanta? Orange. You said? Okay, I think it said Fanta is really good. I'll probably use that. Thanks. We'll have the same for another case here. Malt is very good and not sugary. Heineken.
Okay.
You said you wanted to say
Say
something.
Heineken. I said, when you say Heineken, I said, Ushe.
Okay. I don't know. I would say this one is for the big boys, not for anyone less than 18. Okay, the last one we have here is fruit juice. What I have here, very healthy. Very healthy. And so, if you should have any other drink outside what I just defined, they on their own would have this. Your favorite drink is good for you, and that's it. Okay, so I think that's that for the switch statement we have here. So I'll save this now, and I would have to reload this. I don't think this would work. And I would also need to comment this one, or I'll just give this a hard coded score. We don't have an issue with the second one. Okay, so we have this now. Open with live server, enter your favorite drink. Call mine. Yeah, Fanta is really good. Okay, I'll need to just comment all those ones out. It's too much. Tell your favorite drink. Malt. Very good. Not sugary. Heineken. The big boy is not for anyone less than 18. Mm. Fruit juice. Yeah, it's good for you. That's it. Now, any other absurd drink out there, I put not really absurd anyway, but not present in our code. I'll probably say Mirinda. Yeah, it's good for you. That's it. Okay, is that what we have there? Okay, okay, yes, that's what we have there. It's good for you, and that's it. So this is how you make use of the switch statement, if else, and else if statement. It's very very simple to understand, and it's very very simple to apply. So I think that's that for today's class. Thank you, and we'll meet on our next class.